Steffani, if you could start by talking about the title of the work. It's a title in Latin to mean fuller meaning, but that you've applied a specific meaning to the new video that you've commissioned as a result of your inclusion in the 10th satellite program. Could you just start by talking maybe about the decision to choose that title?
Sure. The phrase sensus plenior, on the one hand, it's a Latin phrase, as you said, that means literally fuller meaning. At the same time, it has a very particular use in the Catholic hermeneutics, in the interpretation of the Bible itself. In Catholicism, sensus plenior refers to a kind of particular way of thinking about how we can read the word beyond simply the text. When approaching the Bible, what tools do we have to interpret and understand what we read? How do we make decisions about the broader information that we and resources intellectually that we bring to bear on the text itself? I think a lot about the kind of European tradition of hermeneutics as I approach my work, in the sense that this question of interpretation, what does it mean to understand? How do we know that we understand? What are the limits of understanding? Those are at the core of my practice.
In the work Sensus Plenior, the work poses a specific relationship to the practice of mime through the ordained minister Susan Webb and the Master Mime Ministry of Harlem. And for me, what was so fascinating about encountering that practice is that it was one unknown to many people who know about the history of mime. So could you talk about how you encountered this specific practice of mime that's very much part of the 21st century?
Sure. I didn't grow up as a religious person, but I have always had a relationship to the church. It's difficult for me to identify my first experience of mime in the church, but I can point to a very strong and very particular experience, which was at the funeral service of my grandfather. I was then and still am fascinated by and deeply moved by the practice of mime as a way of extending the text of gospel song sort of into the body and through the body. So it became very clear to me that this was a different way to think about movement, a different way to think about the body as a kind of mediator. What's interesting to me about Susan Webb is the way in which her work exists at the intersection between multiple modes of making. She has developed, in conversation with others who practice this movement form that refers to a history of black dance, that refers to 20th century physical theater and mime, but that also draws much more broadly from a kind of range of ritual and historical traditions. From the perspective of Susan Webb, I think pantomime is the foundation of all movement traditions, that to imitate through movement is the beginning of any kind of theatrical tradition, any kind of movement-based cultural tradition. For me, what's so challenging, what's so fascinating about her practice is that it invites us to think in a new way about how movement can function not as performance. So how can we find other models for thinking about what it means to move for a viewer?
I'm trying to get this idea that maybe there is a radical black tradition that kind of doesn't only contextualize your work, but actually gives another art historical trajectory that we might want to open up with regards to how black artists, particularly working with new media, have had to sort of find a language within which to talk about issues around race, but in ways that either are more abstracted or that nuance that narrative.
For me, my practice is really about finding new forms, new trajectories, new routes, new pathways for thinking about the ways in which black radical expression in the US, and not exclusively in the US, has flourished, has developed. I'm constantly sort of thinking about where we can look to find fresh thinking about what it is that art can do, fresh thinking about what it is that movement can do, fresh thinking about how we communicate with each other. And I mean, part of the reason that it's complicated when you put it in this way around Black, like framing of the Black experience, is that I actually don't think, you know, I mine the history of Black expression because it's been so rarely considered, not because the tools that I find there can only be used to frame Black experience, and not because framing Black experience as a kind of referent is my goal, my only goal, or the most important goal, or even, you know, what I think Black artists are most interested in these days. Instead, it's really to consider what has been overlooked by the sort of dominant narratives of art history, to find other models, other ways of thinking about what it is that art can and should do and be.